Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1876. The American frontier was still wild and unforgiving, with civilization struggling to take root in the vast Kansas plains. Westward expansion had brought waves of settlers, adventurers, and fortune-seekers across these territories, individuals leaving behind the comforts and constraints of established society to pursue new beginnings in lands that promised both opportunity and danger in equal measure. Among the scattered homesteads and emerging towns along the Santa Fe Trail, a particular establishment gained a quiet reputation among travelers. Situated approximately 17 miles southwest of Dodge City, just off what locals called the Southern Route, stood Blackwood Inn. According to county records filed at the Ford County Courthouse in January of 1873, the two-story clapboard structure was built by Edmund Blackwood, a former merchant from St. Louis, who arrived with sufficient capital to establish what was then considered a respectable stopping point for weary travelers. The building permit, still preserved in county archives, described a structure measuring 42 feet in length and 36 feet in width, with an attached stable capable of housing 6 horses and storage for 2 wagons. The location was strategic, far enough from Dodge City to capture tired travelers unable to reach town before nightfall, yet close enough to benefit from the steady stream of commerce flowing along the established trade routes. The inn offered 6 private rooms upstairs, each furnished with a simple bed, washstand, and clothes hook. A common sleeping area occupied the rear of the ground floor, where for 50 cents a traveler could claim floor space and basic shelter for the night. The modest dining room occupied the front portion of the first floor, where simple but filling meals were served at communal tables constructed of rough-hewn local timber. Adjacent to the dining area was a small parlor with a stone fireplace where during winter months guests could gather for warmth and conversation. The building itself was unremarkable in construction, typical frontier architecture with a wide front porch, shuttered windows, and a pitched roof topped by a single brick chimney that released thin trails of smoke visible for miles across the flat landscape. Between 1874 and 1877, the Blackwood Inn developed what one local newspaper cryptically referred to as a most peculiar collection. The article, published in the Dodge City Times on August 4, 1877, mentioned in passing that the proprietor of Blackwood's establishment has accumulated quite the assortment of travelers' possessions, though whether by design or abandonment remains a subject of local speculation. This brief reference, occupying merely 2 lines in a broader piece about businesses along the Santa Fe Trail, might have remained nothing more than frontier curiosity had it not been for subsequent discoveries. What drew our investigative attention to this particular establishment wasn't its architectural features or its business model, but rather a curious pattern documented in fragmentary records and correspondence that only emerged decades later. In the spring of 1962, members of the Ford County Historical Society conducted an excavation of the property, which had by then long been abandoned and reclaimed by the prairie. Their primary objective was to document the precise location and dimensions of structures along the historic trail as part of a broader preservation initiative. What they discovered, however, shifted their focus dramatically. Beneath a layer of soil and prairie grass, they uncovered not only the foundation stones of the original inn, but also a leather-bound ledger that had somehow survived decades of exposure to the elements, protected by the collapsed remains of what appeared to be a metal strongbox. The ledger, though partially damaged by moisture and time, contained what appeared to be meticulous documentation of guests and their stays, alongside notations of items that remained after their departure. The pages were filled with a precise, flowing handwriting that suggested an educated hand, each entry dated and organized with methodical attention to detail that seemed at odds with the typically haphazard record-keeping of frontier establishments. The historian who first examined the document, Dr. Martin Kerrigan of the University of Kansas, remarked in his field notes that the penmanship suggests someone with formal education, possibly European training, given certain flourishes characteristic of continental script. The initial documentation suggested nothing sinister, merely the ordinary business of an innkeeper tracking his clientele. Names, dates, points of origin, and destinations form the basic structure of each entry, followed by notes about payment received and services rendered. But as researchers began cross-referencing the entries with other historical records, stagecoach manifests, postal service logs, business correspondence, and family histories, discrepancies emerged that could not be easily explained away. The most troubling pattern became apparent when comparing the ledger with records of arrivals in various destination cities. A significant number of travelers who had documented stays at Blackwood Inn never completed their intended journeys. The first recorded disappearance, though it wasn't recognized as such at the time, was that of William Forrester, a cattle buyer from Wichita who, according to the ledger, stayed at the inn on April 17, 1874. The notation beside his name initially recorded standard information: Room 3, 1 night, payment in full. Below this, added in what appeared to be the same hand, but perhaps at a later time, was a separate entry: left walking boot, right side. Poor condition, but salvageable. Notable arch structure. The significance of this additional notation wasn't immediately apparent to researchers until they discovered that Forrester was expected in Dodge City the following day for a prearranged meeting with a rancher named Thomas Langford. According to Langford's business records, Forrester never arrived, resulting in the cancellation of a significant cattle purchase. Correspondence between Langford and Forrester's employer in Wichita revealed that the missed meeting was initially attributed to changed plans or alternate business opportunities. The employer's letter, dated May 2, 1874, stated, "We have received no word from Forrester since his departure for your region, and assume he has pursued other ventures in the territories further west, as he had previously expressed interest in expanding our operations in that direction." No formal inquiry was ever made. The ledger entry stands as the last documented evidence of Forrester's existence. His name appears in no subsequent census records, land transactions, or business registries. Over the next 3 years, the pattern repeated with disturbing regularity. The ledger documented at least 27 instances of guests who left behind personal items: a pocket watch, a wedding band, a distinctive hat, a set of ivory combs. In at least 17 of these cases, there exists no historical record of these individuals ever reaching their stated destinations. More troubling still, few formal investigations were conducted. In the chaotic environment of the frontier, people vanished with alarming frequency. Death by exposure, conflict with indigenous peoples, outlaw activity, or simple desertion of former lives were all common enough occurrences that authorities rarely invested resources in locating missing persons unless they were of particular prominence or wealth. What makes the Blackwood Inn case especially disturbing is not merely the disappearances, but the methodical documentation that accompanied them. Each entry in the ledger described the personal item with unsettling precision: the material, condition, estimated value, and occasionally a notation about its contribution to the collection. One such entry from September 1875 read, "Silver pocket watch monogrammed JTM, excellent craftsmanship, unusual engravings inside case. A superior edition." This particular entry corresponded to Jonathan T. Moreland, a land surveyor who had been traveling to Colorado Territory and whose family in Illinois reported him missing after several months without correspondence. The Moreland case represented one of the few instances where official inquiries were made. A letter from Illinois State Senator Robert Moreland to the governor of Kansas Territory, dated November 18, 1875, requested assistance in locating his brother. Jonathan departed Springfield on August 3rd with the stated intention of surveying potential rail routes through southern Colorado. His last correspondence, posted from Wichita, indicated he would follow the Santa Fe Trail westward. We have received no further communication despite his assurance of regular letters. I respectfully request any assistance your office might provide in determining his whereabouts. The governor's reply, preserved in Illinois State Archives, offered perfunctory assurances of cooperation, but noted the challenges of locating individuals in the territories. No record exists of any substantive investigation. The region surrounding the inn offered ample opportunity for concealment. To the southwest lay a series of low ravines locally known as the Splits, where flash floods had carved irregular crevices into the landscape. These narrow channels, some reaching depths of 15 to 20 feet, created a maze-like terrain difficult to navigate and perfectly suited for concealing evidence. To the northwest stretched several miles of tall prairie grass, punctuated by the occasional copse of cottonwoods. A person, or indeed many persons, could vanish into such terrain, and evidence of their passing would be erased by the next strong wind or rain. The proximity of the Arkansas River, approximately 4 miles to the north, provided another potential disposal site, as the river's current could carry remains considerable distances before discovery, if ever. During spring months, when snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains swelled the river's volume, anything deposited in its waters could be transported dozens or even hundreds of miles downstream, dispersing evidence beyond recovery. These geographical factors would have been immediately apparent to anyone familiar with the region, particularly someone who had selected the location specifically for its isolation and natural features conducive to concealment. According to land registry documents preserved in the Ford County Courthouse, Edmund Blackwood was not a native Kansan. He arrived from Missouri in late 1872, though earlier records suggested previous residences in Pennsylvania and briefly in New Orleans. His background before arriving in Kansas remained largely undocumented, which was not unusual for the era. The frontier attracted individuals seeking fresh starts, and questions about one's past were considered impolite at best and potentially dangerous at worst. What little is known comes from his business license application, which described him as 43 years of age, unmarried, of sound constitution, and financial stability. The application was accompanied by references from two St. Louis merchants, both of whom had themselves passed away by 1880, leaving no opportunity for later investigators to verify their acquaintance with Blackwood. Contemporary descriptions of Blackwood are frustratingly inconsistent, suggesting either a man of remarkably variable appearance or, more troublingly, the possibility that multiple individuals may have presented themselves under this identity. A letter from a cattle driver to his wife in Topeka, dated June 1874, described the innkeeper as a tall fellow, gray at the temples, with the manner of an educated man fallen somewhat in circumstances. He speaks with a slight accent I cannot place, perhaps from the eastern states or even abroad. His conversation reveals familiarity with literature and current events, surprising in this remote location. Yet another account, from a land surveyor's journal entry of April 1875, portrayed him as of medium height, dark-complexioned, with an intensity of gaze that suggests he misses nothing. His hands are notably fine, not those of a man accustomed to physical labor, but rather the hands of a scholar or perhaps a physician. He inquired with particular interest about my surveying equipment, displaying knowledge of scientific instruments that seemed incongruous with his current occupation. These contradictory descriptions, while possibly reflecting subjective impressions, have led some researchers to speculate whether multiple individuals may have operated the inn under the Blackwood name. This theory gained credibility with the discovery in 1967 of a Missouri business directory from 1870 that listed an Edward Blackwood as proprietor of a small apothecary in St. Louis, describing him as formerly of Philadelphia, specializing in surgical supplies and preservation materials for medical specimens. No record exists of this business after 1871, nor of any formal transfer or sale of its assets. The inn's daily operations, as far as can be determined from accounts, followed a predictable pattern. Travelers typically arrived in late afternoon or early evening, particularly those following the Santa Fe Trail who had departed Dodge City too late to make significant progress before nightfall. Blackwood himself reportedly greeted guests at the door, assessed their means and requirements, and assigned accommodations accordingly. A small copper bell on the front desk could be rung to summon service, though most accounts suggest the proprietor remained consistently present in the public areas, attentive to the needs and conversations of his guests. Meals were served at fixed times, a practical necessity for a small establishment, and consisted primarily of locally sourced provisions: corn, beans, occasional beef or pork, and bread described variously as passable to remarkably fresh for the location. A journal entry from a missionary traveling to Santa Fe in October 1874 noted that the fare at Blackwood's establishment, while simple, displays evidence of refined preparation unusual for these territories. The proprietor mentioned training in New Orleans, which perhaps explains the subtle seasoning that elevates otherwise common ingredients. Most peculiar was his insistence on watching as we ate, ostensibly to ensure satisfaction, though the effect was somewhat discomfiting. Most guests departed after a single night's stay, continuing their journeys at first light. Some, however, remained longer due to weather conditions, health issues, or mechanical problems with wagons or conveyances. The ledger indicates that these extended stays correlated strongly with the disappearances later identified. Of the 17 guests who never reached their destinations, 14 had remained at the inn for more than one night. This pattern suggests a methodology requiring time, either for selection, preparation, or simply opportunity. A particularly revealing account comes from a letter written by Franklin Mercer, a hardware merchant who stayed at the inn in May 1876 while traveling to Denver. Writing to his business partner, he observed, "The second night of our delay due to wheel repairs brought a most curious interaction. Blackwood engaged me in conversation regarding my family connections, seeming particularly interested in whether anyone expected my arrival in Denver on a specific date. When I mentioned my wife would await word before joining me, his manner changed perceptibly, becoming less attentive and almost dismissive. By morning, his previous solicitude had returned, though I noted he redirected similar inquiries to a young man traveling alone who had arrived the previous evening. The inn's isolation proved both its business advantage and the likely reason its unusual activities remained unscrutinized for so long. While the Santa Fe Trail brought regular traffic, the specific location of Blackwood Inn meant that travelers often arrived alone or in small groups, separated from larger caravans. The nearest neighboring property was over 4 miles away, a distance that ensured privacy and autonomy. Even the occasional passing of military patrols or mail carriers offered little oversight, as these official representatives typically continued to more established waypoints rather than stopping at private enterprises without specific cause. A territorial map from 1875, preserved in the Kansas State Archives, shows the Blackwood property clearly marked, with the notation "Inn and Way Station," accompanied by the surveyor's comment, "Isolated position." No adjacent structures or settlements within visual range. This isolation would have been particularly profound at night, when the darkness of the prairie, uninterrupted by artificial illumination, would have created a perimeter of impenetrable blackness around the inn's lights. Many frontier accounts mention the psychological effect of such isolation, describing the sensation of being suspended in a void, with the lighted building representing the only evidence of human presence in an otherwise empty landscape. What exactly transpired at Blackwood Inn during those years cannot be stated with absolute certainty. The physical evidence recovered during the 1962 excavation provided tantalizing but incomplete insights. Among the artifacts recovered were personal effects matching some of the ledger descriptions: a corroded pocket watch, several buttons of unusual design, a woman's tortoiseshell hair comb, and, most disturbing, a collection of 23 pairs of boots and shoes of varying sizes and styles, many showing signs of prolonged wear before being carefully cleaned and preserved. These items were found not scattered throughout the property as might be expected from casual abandonment, but rather carefully arranged in a small windowless room adjacent to what had been Blackwood's private quarters. The room measured approximately 8 feet by 6 feet and was accessed through a door concealed behind a large wardrobe in the main bedroom. This hidden chamber did not appear on the original building plans filed with the county clerk's office in 1873, suggesting it may have been added later or deliberately concealed from official documentation. The walls were lined with crude shelving, each section carefully labeled with dates corresponding to ledger entries. Most unsettling was the discovery that the floorboards showed evidence of having been repeatedly removed and replaced, suggesting access to a space beneath the structure that was not identified in the original excavation due to time and budget constraints. Dr. Kerrigan's field notes describe the discovery in clinical terms that nevertheless convey his discomfort. The concealed room presents a disturbing tableau. Items are arranged not for storage but for display, each positioned with apparent care and accompanied by small labels in the same handwriting as the ledger. The preservation of these articles, particularly the footwear, suggests regular maintenance over time. Most troubling is the evident selectivity. These are not random possessions, but rather items chosen for specific qualities, perhaps significance to the owner or some criteria understood only by the collector. Unlike the business ledger, this volume contained no names or dates, only detailed sketches of human hands and feet, with meticulous measurements and notations about bone structure, skin texture, and what appeared to be assessments of quality and suitability. The final pages contained anatomical drawings that experts from the University of Kansas Medical School later identified as depicting the process of preserving human tissue through a variation of techniques used in medical specimen preparation of the period. The impression is unavoidably that of a curated exhibit rather than simple storage. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered a false panel in the floorboards of this room, beneath which lay a second, smaller, leather-bound book. Doc Chach. Harold Whitcomb, professor of forensic medicine who examined the document in 1963, concluded, "These drawings and notations display knowledge consistent with medical training of the mid-19th century, particularly techniques developed for preserving anatomical specimens for educational purposes. The level of detail suggests first-hand familiarity with preservation methods rather than merely theoretical knowledge. Most concerning are the modifications described for preserving specific features, such as fingerprints or palmar creases, that have no standard medical application, but would be consistent with a desire to maintain the unique characteristics of an individual's extremities. One particularly disturbing page contained what appeared to be a philosophical justification. The essence of a person resides not in their entirety, but in those elements most characteristic of their existence. The hands that have performed distinctive labor, the feet that have traveled unique paths, these retain the imprint of a life lived. The rest is merely common biology, unremarkable and unworthy of preservation. By isolating and maintaining those features of true uniqueness, one captures the essential quality more effectively than any photograph or written description could achieve. Is this not the purest form of remembrance? To preserve not merely the image, but the very substance of distinction. Another entry, dated simply Winter 1875, elaborated on this disturbing philosophy. Today's subject presented hands of remarkable character, the right displaying evidence of an old fracture that healed imperfectly, creating an asymmetry I have not previously encountered. The pattern of calluses suggests prolonged use of writing implements, consistent with his profession as a correspondent for an Eastern newspaper. The contrast between his refined hands and the coarsened appendages of typical frontier travelers reinforces my conviction that each human carries with them physical manifestations of their unique journey through life. A letter discovered in the personal effects of a Topeka merchant referred to an unwholesome air about the place, not of physical miasma, but of something less definable. The writer advised his business partner to seek accommodation elsewhere, regardless of convenience, as I found myself unable to sleep soundly within those walls, troubled by the sensation of being observed through the long hours of the night. Another account from a cattle driver who stayed at the inn in November 1876 described peculiar sounds emanating from beneath the floorboards, not the scurrying of rodents, but something more deliberate. These are the elements worthy of preservation, not the homogeneous forms that medical schools collect by the dozen. By the winter of 1876, rumors had begun to circulate among regular travelers about the strange atmosphere of Blackwood Inn. The sound ceased immediately when I rose from my bed, resuming only after I had been still for some time. I inquired of Blackwood the following morning if there might be storage areas below, to which he replied that the foundation was solid throughout, offering no space for either storage or vermin. The cattle driver reported feeling a profound relief upon departing those premises, and subsequently altered his regular route to avoid the necessity of staying there again. A particularly detailed account comes from James Harrington, a railroad surveyor who spent 3 nights at the inn during a snowstorm in January 1876. His journal, preserved in the archives of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, records, "During my second night, I was awakened by what I initially took to be a dream, a sensation of light pressure upon my hands, as though someone were examining my fingers. Upon opening my eyes, I perceived a figure standing beside my bed, which immediately retreated from the room. I convinced myself it had been merely a fragment of a dream, but took the precaution of placing my hands beneath my pillow for the remainder of the night. In the morning, Blackwood inquired whether I had slept well, watching my hands with unusual intensity, as I replied in the affirmative. Despite these misgivings, the inn's strategic location ensured a steady stream of new guests, unfamiliar with local whispers. The winter of 1876-1877 was particularly harsh across the Kansas plains, with blizzard conditions forcing many travelers to seek emergency shelter wherever it could be found. The ledger entries during this period show a marked increase in occupancy, with multiple guests often sharing the limited rooms available. Correspondingly, the notations of items contributed to the collection also increased in frequency, suggesting that Blackwood, if indeed he was responsible for the disappearances, may have become more selective or perhaps more bold in his activities. A particularly revealing document from this period is a letter written by Rebecca Holloway, a schoolteacher traveling to take up a position in Dodge City. Writing to her sister in Missouri on December 28, 1876, she described her stay at the inn during a severe snowstorm. The accommodations are basic but adequate, though I find myself disturbed by the proprietor's manner. He seems excessively concerned with my hands, remarking twice on their shape, and asking if I had ever served as an artist's model. When I replied in the negative, he observed that some features are too distinctive to be improved upon by nature or artifice. I confess I secured my door with a chair beneath the handle after this exchange. Holloway continued, "The storm shows no sign of abating, and I fear I may be obliged to remain here another night, though I shall request to share quarters with the older woman who arrived this morning if that proves necessary." There is something in Mr. Blackwood's gaze that suggests he is not merely seeing, but appraising, as though calculating value in a manner disconnected from normal social interaction. I find myself keeping my gloves on whenever in his presence, a precaution that seems to both disappoint and intrigue him. He further noted, most peculiar is the small room adjacent to the dining area, which I glimpsed briefly when the door stood ajar. It appeared to contain display cases of the type one might see in a natural history museum, though I could not discern their contents from my vantage point. When I inquired about this room, suggesting an interest in scientific collections, Blackwood became noticeably agitated, stating curtly that the room contained personal research materials before abruptly changing the subject. I shall make no further inquiries, as his reaction suggested a degree of possessiveness that borders on the concerning. Holloway, unlike many others, completed her journey to Dodge City and took up her teaching position. Her subsequent correspondence makes no further mention of the inn or its proprietor, suggesting she attributed the uncomfortable encounter to the eccentricity often found in isolated frontier establishments. However, a diary entry from February 1877, discovered among her effects after her death in 1912, contains a curious notation. I dreamed again of that place last night and of the collection he spoke of so reverently. I cannot escape the feeling that had the storm cleared sooner, my hands might now reside somewhere other than at the ends of my arms. The fate of Edmund Blackwood and his inn was determined not by legal intervention, but by natural disaster. On April 23, 1877, a prairie fire swept through the region southwest of Dodge City. According to accounts in the Dodge City Times, the fire began during unusually dry conditions and spread rapidly across the grassy plains. The Blackwood Inn, with its wooden construction, was particularly vulnerable. By the time riders from a nearby ranch reached the location, the structure was fully engulfed. The newspaper account described the scene. The conflagration, visible for miles across the prairie, drew attention from the Sutton Ranch, from which riders were dispatched to offer assistance. Upon arriving at Blackwood's establishment, they discovered the structure entirely consumed by flames of remarkable intensity. No human presence was observed in the vicinity, suggesting the property had been abandoned prior to the fire's outbreak, though the presence of horses in the stable indicated recent occupation. The animals were freed from their enclosure and driven to safety. The article continued with a detail that would later assume greater significance. Most curious was the observation by Mr. Sutton's foreman that the fire appeared to have originated from within the structure rather than from the approaching prairie fire, as the interior was fully engulfed while surrounding grasslands remained untouched. This circumstance suggests either carelessness with internal fire sources or perhaps a deliberate setting, though the latter seems improbable given the evident value of the establishment to its proprietor. No bodies were recovered from the ruins, leading to speculation about Blackwood's whereabouts. Some accounts suggested he had departed several days earlier, having been seen boarding a stagecoach bound for Wichita with several trunks and cases. Others claimed to have encountered him on the road to Dodge City the very morning of the fire. A particularly intriguing report came from a freight driver who stated he had passed a wagon approximately 10 miles east of the inn around noon on the day of the fire. The driver described seeing a man matching Blackwood's general description, accompanied by a much younger individual whose face was obscured by a broad-brimmed hat. Their wagon appeared heavily laden beneath a tarpaulin covering. When I raised my hand in customary greeting, neither acknowledged the gesture, an unusual discourtesy on the open road. No official determination of Blackwood's fate was ever recorded, and no person matching his description appears in subsequent census records or business registries in Kansas or neighboring states. The mystery of his disappearance was compounded by the discovery during the 1962 excavation that the foundation of the inn contained a previously undocumented cellar area accessible only through the concealed room. This subterranean space, approximately 12 feet by 14 feet with a ceiling height of 7 feet, showed evidence of having been lined with lead sheeting, an unusual and expensive construction choice for a frontier structure. The lead lining, partially melted by the intense heat of the fire, suggested a purpose requiring protection from moisture or perhaps containment of odors or fluids. The land where Blackwood Inn stood remained unclaimed for nearly a decade following the fire, despite the increasing value of property along established transportation routes. Local residents attributed this to practical concerns about the soil being unsuitable for cultivation due to ash contamination. However, personal journals and church records from the period reveal a more superstitious avoidance of the location. The pastor of First Methodist Church in Dodge City wrote in his private diary, "The congregation rejects any suggestion of utilizing the old Blackwood property for our proposed mission outreach." Though no specific objection is raised, there appears a universal reluctance to establish any presence on that soil. A more explicit articulation of local sentiment appears in the private correspondence of Sheriff Lawrence Deger, who wrote to a colleague in Wichita, "The matter of Blackwood's place remains a source of discomfort among the citizenry, though few will speak directly of their concerns. There persists a notion, unsubstantiated but widely held, that during its operation the establishment claimed more than the usual toll from travelers. In the absence of specific allegations or identified victims, I have refrained from official inquiry, though I confess a certain relief that the structure no longer stands upon our landscape." In 1885, the county eventually sold the land at auction to a cattle company seeking grazing territory. The new owners made no attempt to rebuild any structures on the original foundation, instead establishing corrals and a small bunkhouse nearly half a mile from where the inn had stood. According to company records, cowhand turnover for this particular section was unusually high, with many refusing to remain overnight, preferring instead to ride back to the main ranch house despite the distance. One entry in the ranch foreman's log noted, "Johnson and Mercer report unusual sounds in the vicinity of the old foundation, describing them as scratching from below." Both men have requested reassignment to the western section. Given their reliability in other matters, I am inclined to grant this request rather than lose their services entirely. The story might have faded entirely from historical record had it not been for an unusual discovery made in 1897 during the expansion of the Santa Fe Railroad through the region. Workers excavating a new rail bed approximately 3 miles south of the former inn site uncovered a collection of personal effects buried in a shallow depression: watches, rings, spectacles, and other small items that would have been carried on one's person. Among these was a distinctive silver pendant later identified as belonging to Jacob Merriweather, a dry goods merchant, who had been traveling from Independence to Santa Fe in February 1875, and whose disappearance had prompted one of the few formal investigations associated with missing Blackwood Inn guests. The foreman of the railroad crew, Thomas Hargrove, provided a statement to local authorities describing the discovery. Upon removing approximately 3 feet of soil from the proposed railbed, my men exposed what appeared to be a wooden box of crude construction, partially collapsed due to soil pressure. Within this container were numerous personal effects arranged in a manner suggesting intentional storage rather than casual disposal. Most unsettling was the observation that these items appeared to have been cleaned and organized rather than simply discarded, as might be expected in a case of robbery. Hargrove's statement continued with a detail initially omitted from newspaper accounts. Beneath the layer of personal effects, we discovered what appeared to be preserved human hands, approximately a dozen in total, wrapped individually in oilcloth and arranged in a manner suggesting careful placement rather than hasty concealment. Upon this discovery, I instructed my men to cease excavation and dispatched a rider to alert county authorities. I placed Mr. Reynolds in charge of securing the site until official representatives arrived. The investigation that followed the railroad discovery was cursory at best. The items were cataloged and held briefly by the Ford County Sheriff's Office before being claimed by various family members who could prove relation to the presumed owners. The Dodge City Globe's headline of November 12, 1897, read, "Blackwood's Collection. Found railroad workers uncover grim reminder of frontier mystery." The article beneath this provocative headline was notably circumspect, avoiding direct accusations while clearly suggesting a connection. The discovery of personal effects belonging to travelers known to have passed through our region in years past has revived memories of the establishment once operated by Edmund Blackwood, whose fate remains unknown following the conflagration of 1877. No formal connection to Blackwood or his inn was established in official records, though local newspapers made the association explicit. While authorities declined to speculate on the nature of this discovery, the proximity to the former inn and the identification of items belonging to persons who disappeared during its operation invite obvious conclusions. Conspicuously absent from the public account was any mention of the human remains reportedly discovered alongside the personal effects. This omission appears to have been a deliberate decision by local authorities, concerned about both the macabre nature of the discovery and its potential impact on the region's growing reputation as a civilized extension of Eastern society, rather than the Wild West of popular imagination. Perhaps most unsettling were the findings never publicly disclosed, but documented in a private letter from Sheriff William Tilghman to the territorial governor. The letter, uncovered during archival research in 1958, described additional discoveries made after expanding the excavation area. Beyond the personal effects first reported, we have located several containers of a preservative nature similar to those used by medical practitioners. More disturbing still are the partial remains which appear to have been subjected to some manner of amateur anatomical study or preservation attempt. I have consulted with Dr. Hamilton, who confirms these were not the result of standard burial practices, nor of natural decomposition. Given the remote location and the years elapsed, I recommend this matter be closed without further public disclosure, as no purpose would be served by alarming the citizenry over crimes long past resolution. The letter continued with an assessment that suggests the sheriff recognized the potential scope of the case. The systematic nature of both the collection and preservation indicates a disturbed mind operating with methodical precision over an extended period. The number of specimens recovered suggests this individual may be responsible for numerous disappearances previously attributed to the general hazards of frontier travel. Given the passage of time and the presumed death or departure of the perpetrator, I consider this matter historically significant, but practically closed from an enforcement perspective. The subsequent development of the region gradually obscured physical traces of the Blackwood Inn's existence. By the early 20th century, the precise location was marked only by a slight depression in the earth where the foundation had once stood. Occasional visitors reported an unusual quietness around the site, a stillness that seemed to absorb rather than transmit sound. A geological survey team in 1934 noted in their field journal that communication becomes difficult within 50 yards of the old foundation, with normal speaking voices failing to carry even short distances, necessitating close proximity for conversation. The team's report continued, "This acoustic anomaly does not appear to have a scientific explanation, given the relatively flat topography and absence of features that might create such an effect." Several team members have reported a reluctance to remain in the area after dusk, citing a subjective sense of observation or scrutiny despite the evident isolation of the location. For purposes of completing our survey efficiently, we have relocated our base camp to a site approximately 1 mile northeast of this position. Interest in the case revived briefly in 1962, when the Ford County Historical Society conducted its excavation of the site as part of a broader initiative to document frontier-era settlements. The discovery of the ledger and the hidden room's contents prompted a short-lived investigation by county authorities, but given the passage of time and the absence of living witnesses, no official conclusions were reached. The materials recovered were stored in the Society's archives, where they remained largely forgotten until a graduate student from the University of Kansas accessed them for research in 1968. The student, Edward Chambers, became so engrossed in the Blackwood case that it eventually formed the basis of his doctoral dissertation in frontier history. His research took him beyond Ford County to archives in Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana, attempting to trace Edmund Blackwood's movements prior to his arrival in Kansas. What he discovered suggested a pattern of similar establishments, small inns or boarding houses operating briefly in isolated locations, followed by the proprietor's departure coinciding with reports of missing travelers. However, the names associated with these earlier businesses varied, and no definitive connection could be established without photographic evidence or reliable physical descriptions. In his research notes, Chambers documented a particularly suggestive pattern. The establishment in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, operated by a James Blackwood from 1863 to 1865, closed abruptly following inquiries from authorities in Philadelphia regarding a missing commercial agent. Similarly, the boarding house in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana, registered to an E.B. Wood from 1866 to 1869, ceased operation immediately after local officials began investigating the disappearance of two riverboat engineers. In both cases, the proprietor departed without formal notice, leaving behind structures similar in design to the later Kansas establishment. Chambers' most significant contribution to the historical record was his discovery of a partial journal, believed to have been written by Blackwood himself, found among uncatalogued materials in the St. Louis Mercantile Library. The journal contained no signature but referenced the Kansas establishment in terms that strongly suggested authorship by the proprietor. The entries, spanning from January to March 1876, revealed a disturbing preoccupation with human uniqueness and preservation. One particularly revealing passage read, "Each human carries with them elements entirely unique, the whirl of a fingerprint, the precise shape of an earlobe, the pattern of veins visible beneath the skin of a wrist. In our mindless rush toward an industrialized future, we fail to recognize that each person who passes from this earth takes with them features that shall never be replicated. My collection, modest though it may be, preserves these singular aspects of humanity that would otherwise be lost to time and decay. Is this not a more noble pursuit than allowing such uniqueness to return to dust, unremarked and unpreserved?" Another entry, dated February 17, 1876, provided disturbing insight into the methodology. The preservation process continues to improve with each attempt. The solution of zinc chloride followed by alcohol immersion produces superior results, particularly for the finer structures of the hands. I have abandoned my earlier attempts with feet, as the results proved inconsistent and generally unsatisfactory. Henceforth I shall focus exclusively on the hands, where the true character of the individual is most clearly expressed. The recent blizzard has provided ample opportunity for selection, as travelers remain longer than customary, due to weather conditions. The gentleman from Colorado possesses particularly interesting hands, the left showing evidence of an old injury that healed in a manner creating an entirely unique configuration of the metacarpals. Perhaps most chilling was the entry dated March 3, 1876. I find the process of selection increasingly refined as my experience grows. Whereas initially I might have been attracted to obvious physical anomalies, an extra digit or unusual proportions, I now recognize that subtlety often provides greater interest in the final specimen. The slope of a knuckle, the particular arrangement of lines across a palm, even the relative lengths of fingers often tell more about a life lived than any obvious deformity. The young woman who departed yesterday left behind hands of extraordinary elegance, though she herself remains unaware of her contribution to posterity. The preservation process was completed before dawn, and all evidence removed before the arrival of the morning stage. I reflect with satisfaction that while her family will mourn an ordinary disappearance, One of countless souls lost to the hazards of frontier travel, her hands will remain perfect and unchanging in my collection, appreciated for their unique beauty, long after conventional remembrance has faded. What became of Chambers and his research represents yet another unsettling chapter in the Blackwood saga. After submitting his dissertation, which received academic recognition but limited public attention, he traveled to Kansas in June 1968, intending to conduct one final examination of the original insight before accepting a teaching position at Colorado State University. According to the last entry in his research journal, he planned to camp near the location to observe how the quality of light and sound might have influenced the experiences of travelers in the 1870s. His final journal entry reads, June 17, 1968. I have established camp approximately 30 yards from what I believe to be the original foundation, now visible only as a slight rectangular depression in the earth. The acoustic properties noted by previous visitors are immediately apparent. There is a quality to the silence here that feels almost manufactured, as though sound is being actively absorbed rather than merely failing to carry. Most interesting is the effect this has on one's perception of isolation. Despite being able to see for miles across the open prairie, there is a persistent sensation of enclosure, as if the site exists in its own pocket of space independent of the surrounding landscape. The entry continues with an observation that takes on disturbing significance in light of subsequent events. As evening approaches, I find myself increasingly aware of a presence that seems to emanate from the direction of the foundation. This is, of course, merely the power of suggestion operating on a mind well versed in the history of this location, but the sensation is remarkably vivid, particularly a feeling of being observed with careful attention. I have set my camera to capture time-lapse images throughout the night, hoping to document any unusual light effects that might help explain the discomfort reported by so many previous visitors. Chambers never arrived at Colorado State. His abandoned vehicle was discovered near the historical inn site approximately 2 weeks after his expected arrival date. A search of the area revealed his camping equipment, research materials, and journal, but no trace of Chambers himself. The journal's final entry, dated June 17, 1968, noted, "The silence here is unlike anything I've experienced, not the absence of sound, but something more absolute, as if the air itself resists vibration. Most remarkable is the quality of isolation. Despite the relatively flat terrain, the site feels entirely removed from the surrounding landscape, as though existing in its own pocket of space. I understand now why travelers might have been reluctant to leave once darkness fell." The disappearance was investigated by both Kansas authorities and the FBI, given Chambers' interstate travel. Despite extensive searches utilizing tracking dogs and volunteers familiar with the terrain, no definitive evidence of his fate was ever discovered. The case remains officially open but inactive in Ford County records. The lead investigator, Deputy Sheriff Michael Crandall, noted in his final report, "All evidence suggests Dr. Chambers was alone at the time of his disappearance. No signs of struggle, violence, or forced departure were identified at his campsite. Personal effects, including wallet, identification, and valuables, remained undisturbed. The most plausible explanation involves voluntary departure or accidental injury at a distance from the camp, though extensive search operations have failed to support either theory. Given the historical focus of Dr. Chambers' research, we have considered the possibility of elaborate hoax or intentional disappearance, but communications with colleagues and family members indicate no predisposition toward such behavior." In a particularly eerie parallel to the historical pattern, Chambers' journal listed an inventory of personal items he had brought to the site, with the final entry noting, "My grandfather's pocket watch, silver, monogrammed ETC, family heirloom." This watch was among the items recovered from his abandoned camp, positioned carefully on top of his journal rather than stored in his personal effects, as though deliberately placed there as a final communication. The film from Chambers' camera was developed but revealed nothing unusual, merely a series of increasingly dark images as night fell, followed by the gradual lightening of dawn. The final frame, however, showed what appeared to be a figure standing at the edge of the depression where the inn's foundation had been. Analysis by FBI technicians determined that this was likely an artifact created by light leak in the camera rather than an actual human presence, though this conclusion has been disputed by some researchers who point to what appears to be a distinctive silhouette consistent with period descriptions of Blackwood. In 1969, following Chambers' disappearance, the Ford County Historical Society made the decision to seal the Blackwood materials in their archive, restricting access to credentialed researchers who obtained specific permission from the board of directors. This policy remained in effect until 1985, when budget constraints led to the transfer of many archival materials to the Kansas State Historical Society in Topeka. During this transfer, several items from the Blackwood collection, including the ledger and the anatomical journal, were reported missing from their catalog locations. An internal investigation suggested improper storage rather than theft, but the items have never been recovered. The official report stated, inventory discrepancies appear to result from inadequate tracking during multiple relocations of archived materials between 1970 and 1984. No evidence suggests unauthorized access or deliberate removal. Given the sensitive nature of these particular materials and their historical significance, we recommend enhanced security protocols for remaining items associated with the Blackwood case, including the implementation of a specialized access log and photographic documentation to prevent future losses. What persists today are fragmented records, inconsistent testimonies, and the persistent question of what actually transpired at Blackwood Inn during those frontier years. The physical location, now private ranch land, shows no visible trace of its history. No marker commemorates the site or its connection to the disappearances. The current landowners, when contacted for this documentary, expressed no knowledge of the historical events and declined to permit access for filming. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Blackwood mystery is its illustration of how easily human lives could vanish on the American frontier, not only through natural hazards or violent conflict, but through calculated actions that exploited the very transience of frontier society. In an era before photographs were common, before consistent identity documents, before instantaneous communication, a traveler might disappear and leave behind nothing but the fading memory of their passing in the minds of strangers. The items recovered from Blackwood Inn, those personal effects so carefully cataloged in the ledger, represent more than mere possessions. They stand as the only concrete evidence that their owners ever existed, ever passed through that remote Kansas waypoint. In this sense, Edmund Blackwood's disturbing observation holds a kernel of truth. Each traveler did leave behind something unique, something that would otherwise have vanished completely from human record. The final accounting of Blackwood's activities may never be complete. The precise number of travelers who entered his establishment but never departed remains unknown. The full extent of his collection can only be estimated based on the fragmentary records that survived the fire and subsequent decades. What can be stated with certainty is that during those 3 years on the Kansas frontier, the unremarkable establishment known as Blackwood Inn became the terminus for numerous journeys that should have continued, lives interrupted, and ended in that place of manufactured silence. The psychology that drives such methodical predation remains as incomprehensible today as it was to frontier communities struggling to understand the disappearances. The historian Francis Parkman, writing about the American frontier, once observed that civilization has a frontier where the rules of society grow thin. In such spaces, individuals like Edmund Blackwood could operate in the margins, exploiting the tenuous nature of social connections and accountability. For those who study historical crimes, the Blackwood case represents a distinctive type of frontier predator, not the impulsive outlaw or the opportunistic thief, but a calculating collector who viewed human uniqueness as something to be preserved through possession. This perspective transforms travelers from individuals with agency and destination into specimens valued only for their distinctive features, reduced from humanity to mere objects of fascination. The final piece of the Blackwood puzzle emerged in 1964, when demolition workers clearing an abandoned storage facility in Wichita discovered a steamer trunk containing what appeared to be preserved human remains, specifically 24 hands and 17 feet, each carefully treated with preservative chemicals and wrapped in oilcloth. Accompanying these remains was a handwritten catalog corresponding to entries in the Blackwood ledger. Authorities quickly contained the discovery, and the remains were eventually interred in an unmarked section of Highland Cemetery in Wichita. The documentation, however, was retained in sealed police archives until reviewed during a cold case initiative in 1988. The official report described the discovery in clinical terms. Container held anatomical specimens in varied states of preservation, primarily disarticulated human extremities. Preservation methods consistent with late 19th century anatomical techniques utilizing solutions of zinc chloride, alcohol, and arsenic compounds. Accompanying documentation suggests collection occurred between approximately 1874 and 1877, with notations corresponding to individuals known to have traveled through Kansas during this period. Specimens show evidence of careful removal, suggesting knowledge of anatomical structure beyond that of a layperson. The review concluded that given the passage of time and the absence of definitive evidence linking the remains to specific missing persons, no further investigation was warranted. The report noted, however, that the methodical nature of the preservation and documentation suggests these actions were performed by an individual with some anatomical knowledge and a disturbing commitment to the collection of human specimens. The historical context and geographical proximity strongly support a connection to the Blackwood Inn case, though definitive proof remains elusive. Dr. Eleanor Voss, a forensic anthropologist who examined the materials during the 1988 review, provided additional insights in an academic paper published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 1990. The preservation techniques employed suggest formal training or, at minimum, extensive self-education in anatomical practices of the period. The precision of the dissection indicates familiarity with proper tools and procedures. Most notable is the consistent pattern of selection. In each case, the specimens were removed with minimal damage to the distinctive features the collector apparently valued. This level of care argues against opportunistic collection or trophy-taking behavior typically associated with violent criminals, suggesting instead a methodical, almost academic approach to the acquisition and preservation of these human remains. Local folklore surrounding the Blackwood case has evolved over the decades, often incorporating elements unsupported by historical evidence. Tales of travelers hearing the voices of previous victims, reports of phantom lights seen at the former inn site, and stories of the collector still wandering the prairie in search of distinctive features to add to his collection have become standard elements of regional ghost stories. While these supernatural embellishments have no basis in documented fact, they speak to the profound impact the case has had on the collective imagination of the area. In a recorded oral history interview conducted by the Kansas Folklore Society in 1979, lifelong Dodge City resident Margaret Sutton, then 93 years old, recalled, "My father wouldn't speak of that place directly. If business required travel in that direction, he would make a considerable detour rather than pass near the site, even decades after the inn was gone. When pressed on the matter, he would only say, 'Some ground remembers what's happened upon it.' Many locals shared this sentiment, though few would articulate the specific fears associated with the location. In 1992, during construction of a pipeline across the region, workers reported finding a small metal container approximately half a mile from the presumed end site. Inside were several preserved human fingers, each bearing a distinctive ring. Before authorities could properly document this discovery, the container and its contents reportedly disappeared from the temporary field office where they had been stored. The construction company denied any knowledge of the items, and the workers who made the initial find provided conflicting accounts when questioned. This incident, while never officially connected to the historical Blackwood case, adds yet another layer of uncertainty to an already ambiguous narrative. The enduring question remains not just what happened at Blackwood Inn, but why the case continues to resonate with those who encounter it. Perhaps it is the fundamental human fear of being erased, not merely of dying, but of having one's existence reduced to fragments, collected and cataloged by another's obsession. In the vast expanses of the American frontier, where a person might travel for days without encountering another human being, this vulnerability was particularly acute. Edmund Blackwood, whatever his true identity and however many lives he may have claimed, exploited this vulnerability with a calculating precision that transcends typical notions of frontier violence. For the contemporary observer, the Blackwood case offers a unique perspective on the darker aspects of westward expansion, the spaces between established communities where the fundamental structures of civilization grew tenuous, where a person might vanish without investigation or consequence. In such environments, predators could operate not through overwhelming force, but through patience and calculation, exploiting the very transience that characterized frontier society. As our documentary investigation concludes, we leave the Blackwood Inn case where history has placed it, partially documented, incompletely understood, a disturbing reminder that even in the wide-open spaces of the American West, darkness could find purchase in the most seemingly ordinary establishments. The next time you pass a remote building standing alone against the horizon, consider what stories its walls might contain, what journeys might have ended within its confines, and what unique, irreplaceable elements of humanity might remain there, cataloged and preserved by hands driven by obsessions we can only dimly comprehend.